Pour écouter cette session en français, veuillez cliquer en bas de votre écran sur l'onglet Interprétation et sélectionner le drapeau français.
Hello, bonjour.
Barry Saleho.
On behalf of ICLE Africa,
the African Center for Cities,
Our Future Cities,
Red Cross Crescent Climate Center,
and partners, we're excited to welcome all of you
to the Rise Africa 2022 Action Festival.
Rise Africa has been growing since 2020
as a platform for thinkers,
doers,
and enablers,
committed to inspiring action for sustainable cities.
This year's theme is
creativity.
For me, this means blending skills to be able to communicate the climate change complexity in rapidly urbanizing cities.
I think we have such untapped potential in Africa when it comes to creativity. There's so much about Africa that is yet to be told.
There are so many people in the African continent who have a huge skill base and are creative in the way they approach challenges.
Creativity in Africa is about embracing our own. It's about dynamism and it's about embracing our indigenous knowledge.
I think agency is finding ways of giving power back to people, to groups, to young people, especially on a continent where it's a very young population.
I like the approach of bringing everyone together, right? It doesn't necessarily need to be this expert, this high-ranking official.
I think what agency means to me is change from the ground up.
The importance of urgency is the recognition of the past and the recognition that we've lost time.
Urgency is about acting now to build more inclusive, productive, and resilient cities.
There's this need to creatively redesign and unlearn and explore new ways of thinking.
The festival is hosting 33 sessions
with 135 provocateurs
from across Africa and the world.
Every session aims to show new ideas,
showcase ongoing action,
and launch new initiatives, bringing participants together
to chart a new route forward.
We hope that the festival program will inspire you.
At the festival, we encourage you to showcase your business and projects,
build lasting partnerships,
unleash your creative potential,
commit to sustainable action.
Rise Africa is about translating ideas into action. What actions are you going to commit to this festival?
Before the session begins, it is important to note that you're being recorded.
And by participating, you are given the consent to be recorded.
All recordings will be available on the program page after the festival.
Creative expression is vital for creating new futures for our cities.
And so we invite you to enter this session in the spirit of creativity and dreaming.
I don't expect you to clown yourselves and collapse the distance and difference between sharing bread and sharing bed. I know that feeling, so give me a break and stop the fake. They say a hungry man is an angry man, but I say I am not hungry, I am hunger. I am not angry, I am anger. I am not dangerous, I am danger. I am an abominable time bomb, able to blast limestones and thunderbolts because somehow I am torn, tried and tired. So you see, you don't have to hear the sound of my voice before you know that hunger is real, scarcity is not. So please, check the time. It's history time, passion time, meaning time, access time, free flow time, sharing time, bread time, your time, my time, our time. Now, oh, now is urgent time.
Hello, everyone, wherever you may be in South Africa, Africa, and across the world. I'm Rashiq Fataar, the CEO of Our Future Cities, and thank you so much for joining us today on day 2 of Rise Africa 2022 Action Festival. Our session today, Futures and Possibilities for Our Cities. It's this session where we get to speak to amazing practitioners from across the continent, Freetown, Kampala, Cape Town, Stellenbosch, all in one one room per se, as one might say on Zoom, to explore their projects and learn from their perspectives around what is possible, not necessarily what's futuristic, but what our possible futures are, whether it's in the next year, in the next 3 years, 5, 10 years, and how they work within that space. Geshi earlier in her keynote spoke about unvisioning African cities, and that's because we've for so long been focused on the future being stable and finite and predictable, and that it might require lots of unlearning to work in the space of the future, and to rather ask what capabilities, institutions do we have, values do we have to start to engage in that future, especially because a lot of the practices, even in the environmental space or the design space, are still quite emergent. I will share a very brief presentation, just a bit about our work and what we do, as well as some of the other sessions which will be happening throughout, well, tomorrow as well. Let's just move it forward. That's the title. So a bit about our future cities. I won't take too long, but it's always good to share a bit of what we do. This is our manifesto, which I'll take you through. We aim to shape the cities of tomorrow by cultivating opportunities to address our urban challenges, creating cities that work for everyone, incorporating foresight in everything we do, even if we are ahead of our time, and that happens quite a bit. We're led by research, experimentation, and diverse perspectives, and those perspectives, some of them will be shared today. We work with governments, businesses, communities, and individuals. So we're not focused solely on a particular sector. We understand that solutions require working across disciplines, dimensions, and scales. And for us, that means sometimes it's anthropologists, sometimes it's architects and engineers, and sometimes it's learning from migrants in certain neighborhoods of our cities. And that our work isn't about the latest trend or buzzword. And we know that there are lots of those in the urbanism and city space. It's how we commit to our just transition incrementally through the small steps and the big leaps, transforming places, shifting mindsets, redesigning systems, changing rules, and developing platforms, because our future on this planet is tied to the future of our cities and towns. We're co-creating future cities that are sustainable and equitable, yes, of course, but also exciting, vibrant, and loved. And as mentioned in the manifesto, our projects have spanned dimensions, scales, and cities. We're not afraid of small incremental projects, be it installations or tactical urbanism. We also love larger projects which look at neighborhoods and cities in a sort of macro perspective, looking at policies around housing. We've been involved in many projects which touch on social media and virtual platforms as well, and involving people through arts, designs, walking tours. So our work doesn't always manifest purely in physical form. And of course, the orange block, you can see Rise Africa being one of the ways in which we are promoting platforms and conversations about the future. If you missed yesterday's session, Design for Innovation, Creativity at the Forefront of Housing, Public Space, and Mobility Solutions, fear not. The session will be online in the next 2 weeks. Of course, today we have our session, Futures and Possibilities for Our Future Cities, or for our cities. And tomorrow we look at a more investment perspective, looking at the sessions entitled Africa Now, an urgent case for investment towards more sustainable cities and towns. And in that session, we look at the disconnect between the financing of sustainable urban development, in particular housing, and why we aren't either building more, financing more housing projects, and why there's sort of a lack of urgency in delivering the kinds of inclusive, integrated cities that we all need. For those who missed the keynote lectures today, at 12 p.m. They are currently online, and the keynote lecturers will join us at 6 p.m. this evening. So please join us for that daily debrief. It'll be your chance for a more informal, relaxed conversation with the amazing keynote lecturers that we've, I think 3 that we had today, and some who joined our morning session at 10 a.m. Just some house rules as we proceed into this world of Zoom. Please keep your Please mute at all times, especially since we're not in a webinar. You're of course welcome to ask questions, leave comments, If possible, please use the raise hand function when we get to the Q&A section. The session is recorded, but I believe Zoom should have notified you of that. And of course, the session will be on the RISE website in the next 2 weeks. As far as possible, please share the session and some of your thoughts and some of the key ideas using the hashtag RiseAfrica2022, as well as the hashtag creativity, agency, urgency. And the team during the duration of this session will share a link to a very, very, very short survey, I promise, which you could hopefully complete in the next day or two to give your perspectives on the overall festival. So I'd like to start by introducing our first guest, Doreen Adengo, who is a registered architect in the United States and Uganda. After completing her undergraduate and graduate studies at the Catholic University and Yale, respectively, she worked for design firms in London, Washington, DC, and New York. Doreen is now based in Kampala, where she founded Adengo Architecture in 2015. I encourage everyone to go to the website. It's really easy to explore all the work and projects. Doreen's research and advocacy work has included exhibits and workshops exploring Ugandan urbanism and design at the Luther Centrum, Kampala, the British Council Uganda, and the Architecture Museum of the Technical University in Munich. She co-curated the African Modernism Architecture of Independence Kampala workshop with Manuel Hirst at the Makerere Art Gallery. She's also taught at the New School and Pratt Institute in New York, which are really great schools, the University of Johannesburg GSA, and is currently a sessional lecturer at Uganda Martyrs University. Doreen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I look forward
Doreen,
to
as I mentioned earlier, there's this tension between, or fear rather, that the future is unknown and that we have to constantly be working in different ways to get to that future. I think we can all say that in our work, the idea of the future is one which is better or more desirable, and that whether we're designing, researching, planning, everything we're broadly doing, especially around Rise Africa, is to inspire better sustainable cities. How are you engaging with that concept of the future in your work, and is it difficult to deal with emergent practices and what's emerging while still keeping your eyes and your work on the future?
That's a good question. I think the best way I could talk about this is to talk about the wetlands in Kampala. Is it possible I can share that slide?
Yeah, go ahead.
The first or second slide. So just to give you the context in Kampala, where Kampala is the capital of Uganda, and originally was built on 7 hills, and it's a very green city. So if you see that image, you'll just see very lush green landscape. But in between the hills, there are wetlands. And this wetlands filter water before it reaches Lake Victoria. So we're also next to Lake Victoria. And that kind of sets up the context in which we're. So if you look at the second slide. So that is an image, an aerial view of Kampala. We see the wetlands, then we see Lake Victoria. Then the next image, this image is from the Kampala City Council, and it shows the wetlands and also the development in between. And I think that one of the tensions that we have is the city is growing really fast, and these wetlands are being depleted. And so some of the concerns that we have as a practice, and this then led me to propose something at University of Johannesburg, where we're very interested in how the city can function best in a way that allows for the wetlands to evolve and not get depleted. And also at the same time, the city wants to develop. So that became one of the big challenges. And that's what led me to proposing this course at UJ, and that led to even further discussions about this. So could I go into that? Or?
Yeah, I had a quick question around, I suppose, advocating for the protection of these wetlands. In the description of the project, you mentioned the fact that these were considered sacred places, but there's also the pressure of development. Is there a bit of advocacy work involved in this? And you know, has there been any response to the kind of processes that you've been promoting?
What I would say is that it's, so I'll use the next image, actually, the one out of UJ. So what happened is that we had the UJ students work together with Makerere students and then actually go into the wetlands. And so in this image, what you see is this clay. So basically there's a lot of productivity in the wetlands. There's a lot of stuff going on within the wetlands, but it's not necessarily, a lot of it is just depleting resources. And so just what is the best way to avoid this? There's no, it's hard to regulate, you know, so the government itself does want to protect the wetlands, but it's, there are people living there. These are informal settlements. And so one of the challenges that we had, even just as teachers and also the students, is just to understand that we were kind of, we're in a position of teaching the practice of design and trying to change, transforming what is taught. So we kind of had to learn in the process. When you go into these informal settlements, we're not there to tell people what to do. We were there to observe. So the next image that I'll show is one of the student projects. It's the next slide. Yeah, this one. And so this is Ilao Martin, student from UJ. And what he's trying to do is kind of show a firing kiln within the wetlands, which it represents a growing community, and it also represents the depletion of resources. So this is just kind of showing the cycle and showing what it is. We didn't propose solutions. We just kind of showed what is going on. So to answer your question, in terms of what is happening in the context, is that we don't have solutions. The most that personally as a practice we try to do is create awareness. And I found that working with students really helped, because we were able to walk into these communities and engage, and then basically learn how to communicate these very difficult, challenging situations. And then we had, small presentations that showed this, and we made a small video, which is on the website. And the more we show this kind of information, the more people are aware. And I think for us, that is more of the goal, awareness, not necessarily able to resolve anything.
And what was the response to your awareness building in some of the communities? Did you find that that design language was appropriate, or did students have to sort of learn to unlearn their vocabulary when engaging with communities, particularly around the protection and the future of the wetlands and the adjacent spaces?
So when we had this presentation at the actual workshop, the students actually invited one of the people in the community to come in and see the presentation. To be honest, I can't remember his response. he was mainly just amazed to see they basically followed a day in his life, and they kind of depicted it through drawings. And it was just amazing for him to see this. The idea was at the very end of the year to have some kind of exhibition back in Uganda where we show the work, but we never got to that point. So it hasn't been this big exhibition. My goal would be to have an exhibition in Kampala that shows all the work that we did, which we did over a year. So, yeah.
How do you engage with not just students, but those that want to intervene immediately around some of the pressing issues? Is there a space to propose or to intervene in the short term and to learn from that, or do you think that awareness building is the route to go?
Well, I think at the time it was a 1-week workshop. So the South African students showed up that Sunday, and the workshop started on Monday, and then the Ugandan students, these are from Makerere, also joined the workshop. And so that meant that for 5 days, each day, the first day they went into the sites for the first time, seeing, even for the Ugandan students, were going into the wetlands for the first time. They'd never actually been in that context. And then the 2 students had to then learn how to communicate with each other. People had different levels of skills, ways of drawing, way of communicating. So then there's also that. So I think that within a week we achieved a lot, but it would be too much to then expect them to then come up with solutions, you know? Yeah.
And in terms of your practices, philosophy around solutions, is solutions really the right word? Or do you have a different philosophy in terms of making proposals for the future?
I think the right word would be proposals. I would like to show now a different image, completely different. This is one of the 3x3, and there's a collage. I found that collages are actually a good way of proposing something without being, so the next, and not this one, but
there we go.
So this collage, yes. So this collage shows Kampala, and it talks about movement and migrants and representation. And so with this, I feel that there's a way in to start a discussion. What we discovered when we're working this project is that there are these buildings that are built by what do you call them? I call them building owners, but just in that way. And what happens is they go to an architect, get drawings, and then they submit them to the city council and get approvals. And then they go and build a different type of building because they know what the average person wants within the building. So they change things. So what we realized is that a lot of these buildings have very many small shops. And the reason we call it 3x3 is that that's around the size of one of the shops.
Yeah.
And so anyways, I feel that exploring this project allowed us to, one, understand what was going on within the city, these 3x3 units, and then saying that, okay, we would like to propose back to the city council that why not accept that the building owners are building something else. They're getting approved drawings and then building something else. Why don't we go back and have a discussion? So that would be one proposal. Have I ever gone to the city council to propose that? No. But that would be one suggestion, for example.
So you're saying that in a particular space, there are actually a couple of possible futures which might happen, but that the current system of building plans and approvals, requires a very specific fixed program, very specific use, and the reality is quite different to that. Doreen, inside these buildings, tell us a bit more about how those programs are different in terms of how you've seen the uses being different to what they initially were meant to be used for, or how humans have actually altered that use.
Let's see the image before. I thought I had a drawing, but maybe I moved it. Oh, maybe the next image, the image that shows. So what we did with this research is we followed one trader called Elvis. So there's an image of Elvis. I think it should be there.
Yeah, I think Zoom just has a delay.
Oh, there it is. Yeah. And we then surveyed his space, which was the 3x3 space. And what we found is that his space, it wasn't just like the 3x3 unit, but it also there's a corridor passing through it. And he was in an actually smaller space than was recommended. And somehow he was able to make things work. And there's a typology of these buildings, these kind of arcades, that works for the building owners. And they either have those 3x3 spaces, or they have even smaller spaces than what, which is what Elvis has. And it's more about of course, the square meters and how they're basically charging. So there's, what I would say is that the buildings are actually really well functioning for what the actual traders are looking for. So unfortunately, there's another drawing that's not here. But we then also made a short video, which I'd encourage people to look at in the website. One thing I should also add that in working on this project, we were working across disciplines. And so when we had the information, we didn't know how to represent it. And so we actually got a video guy who made this video together. And I found that working across disciplines helped, because then we had this short video that explained exactly what you just asked me. So basically that video explains very clearly what Elvis's space is like. Without the video, it's very hard for me to explain it. And so I learned through that it's really important to have these multidisciplinary collaborations. It's very important for us as architects who are very interested in drawing, but we're also storytellers. That's what I learned. And I realized the importance of videos through working with the video guy, that's what I'll call him. And so I'd really encourage everyone to watch the video, the 3x3 video, on the website. And there's also a very short video for the Unit 15X, the one about the wetlands. For the same reason, both show very clearly what is going on in those contexts.
Doreen, last minute, I'm going to put you on the spot and say, give us one possible future that you see for your particular city that might be surprising to some of us, that you've learned through following traders like the Congolese migrants and some of the communities around the wetlands.
I think a possible feature would be with with the traders. They're all connected to markets. There are these large markets within Kampala. So I think a future would be like larger markets that do take into account the user and the space designed for the user, and as well as basically the trader and also the person that's coming, basically the two sides. And just to think in terms of scale, because the city is growing really fast. So a future would be, a more user-friendly environment, knowing that the city has to grow. In terms of the wetlands, I think a possible future would be for the wetlands to remain and not be depleted. So to find a way to kind of push towards allowing the wetlands to continue, because as you mentioned, these were sacred spaces for a reason. So we need to go back to remembering that.
Thank you so much, Doreen. And we've shared the links to your projects and your website in the chat. So and captured some of the questions, which we'll get to a bit later. I'd like to move on to our next guest, Brima Koroma, and we'll be speaking about the potential for devolution or the shifting of powers in African cities or in the African context to local municipalities or local authorities, which is, in my view, quite controversial. Brima Koroma is a Sustainable Development Planner at the Institute of Geography and Development Studies at Njala University and the Director of Research and Training at the Sierra Leone Urban Research Center. Brima has extensive consulting experience with institutions like the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the UN, amongst others. His research focuses on urban livelihoods and the city economy, governance of informal urbanization, disaster risk reduction and cities, and basic infrastructure delivery. Brima, thank you so much for joining us from Freetown and for engaging us on this, what some in South Africa would call a controversial topic, the shifting of powers from centralized, top-down national federal governments to local areas where the people actually are.
Thank you very much. The line is not very stable. That's why I just have the video not on really. So don't worry about that.
That's totally fine. Brima, just for those who are not fully aware, what do we mean by the shifting or the devolution of powers or control to cities? What do we mean? What does that mean on the I suppose in the African context that you've researched so far?
Yeah, of course, as you have noted, devolution of powers and resources have definitely been a very highly contested concept. And it has been a very highly contested concept. And of course, it has also been viewed as a means in which different set of countries can also be able to actually give out some of their key authorities and power. That will definitely allow grassroots participation and involvement in terms of the broader development aspirations. So there will be a kind of a range of other actors definitely have to come on board in the interest of dealing with some of the key city development process, like even transferring some of those decision-making process, implementation powers, functions and responsibilities to legally constituted local government. And those powers often within the context of either political, administrative, as well as fiscal level. And it is basically coming out to actually be able to embrace some of the key response related to the abuse of authority by the ruling elites as a means of actually promoting effective and efficiency in governance based on the interests of the people. So based on that, they actually talk around devolution.
Brima, you mentioned the ruling elites. What are some of the fights or the tussles or the debates that are happening in different cities around sharing powers with cities or local authorities? I know that in some cases, like South Africa, certain functions are allowed to have shifted 4 or 5 years ago, but they've not moved because of political will. Tell us a bit about 1 or 2 other cities or towns where there's this vibrant debates around giving more autonomy to cities and towns.
Well, I mean, within like Africa more generally, there are a few other successfully, countries that are also be actually doing that. And there are other cities, like for instance, look at Morocco and Algeria, for instance. I mean, even though they are able to give out some fee authority, but there are a number of other authorities that are not be actually given to the ministerial authority. So most times they have what you call autonomy in terms of the administrative, political, but often the administrative and fiscal are not often being highly developed. They are often being controlled by the central government. And of course, you look at most cities in Africa, I mean, the cities are often being controlled by opposition parties. On the basis of that, the ruling might also want to look at it as a way in which they can also be able to assert their own influence within the city, and on the basis of actually ensuring that they are able to actually have the kind of votes required. So in instance, we are in some of the key legislations have also pointed out that they are able to actually devolve some of the key functions. It becomes much more difficult. And of course, we have seen it much more clearly that in most African countries, they do not even have any urban planning and development department. I mean, why is also rigid zoning in central areas of many of the cities, I mean, inadvertently contributed to the proliferation of slums and, sprawling development of residential areas. But how the central government can also be able to shift those set of response to, local authorities have been a much more critical challenge. And it's an instance of actually giving them the much needed set of resources, as well as even man capacity to actually be able to deal with some of these different complex urban development challenges that they have also been faced with. So in essence, there have been the kind of reluctance of those devolved powers, that actually affects how where cities can be managed, given the complexity of some of the key urban systems, cities, as well as even the context-specific policies to be able to actually work much more effectively. So there have been that kind of, going forth and back. It has all been much more effective in terms of actually ensuring that they're able to actually develop some of these different functions. Because developing functions goes with resources, and the like.
Right, in some of the articles that you've been involved with and written, you speak a lot about, I suppose, the success in Latin American cities. And a lot of time in the sort of urbanism literature, we point to South American cities and Latin American cities as being more integrated and more inclusive and forward-thinking. What about the devolution of powers in Latin American cities has been, in your perspectives, successful? What have been sort of the tangible outcomes for people in some of those cities and countries?
The notion, devolution really has been that indeed, of course, every other country, they have their own specific set of way in which it's definitely emerged. And these are often been, and depends on the nature, had always been based on either political, economic, as well as social characteristics of the kind of country. That actually, moving towards actually addressing, having this devolution, as the case may be. And in some of those different political strata, it's also very much different because, of course, you have different, some other countries have definitely had about 2-tier, and some other ones have also had about 3-tier layer of governance. And these had their own set of implications as to how best they can actually be able to ensure that these powers are often be developed to local council. But most times, it also being based on the kind of political commitment to actually ensure that these different functions are actually being involved, to those set of different set of layers. And it has also been formed by either at the national level or even at, say, the secondary cities or even at tertiary city level. All of that, often varies as, how countries are actually be able to really develop the different set of functions to the different set of city authority or local government.
I know that some mention the success story of devolution in Kenya, who actually had a specific program. Are there any lessons from the Kenyan experience for other African cities and towns that worked really well? Or would you say that it's really unique? You really can't cookie cutter the way that the powers are shared with cities and towns?
Yeah, it's much more unique, and within what really had been able to actually happen within the Kenya situations, and if you had it actually developed up to the county level as well. I mean, which is not much more peculiar to some other cities, like even, for instance, within Sierra Leone. I mean, of course, some of these things are also be coming up on based on some of the key legislative reforms or constitutional provisions in there. And of course, as you can look within Sierra Leone, I mean, Freetown for particularly, the constitution had not been actually provision for decentralization and devolution. So everything that is coming out is based on advocacy. But some of these other countries that have much more success story, I mean, there is a set of provisions. There have been commitments by national government within some of the key constitutional review process that actually have an entrenched provision within those constitutions that invariably that allow some of these different layers of government to actually function much more effectively as compared to some other cities, as the case may be. But that's not the kind of situation in some other cities that have been there. So at least the legislation had a much more greater role to play. And now effectively, institutional frameworks had also been set up to actually allow them to have that levity in terms of performance. So the legitimacy, the strategy, and also the operational forms which have existed.
Rima, a lot of the sessions at Rise Africa this year are about, cities and towns, controlling their own destiny and delivering projects, but money does matter and finance does matter. And in many cases, cities and towns either can't raise financing or unable to raise taxes at a city level, unlike some US cities and towns. Have there been any examples of cities where they've tried to introduce a city tax to increase their budget or revenue and increase their power? And how has that process gone?
Yeah, of course, you have a number of other cities within Africa that a kind of much more successful process in terms of how their taxes are often raised. But I must point out one of the cities that had been much more problematic. I mean, basically, like even for instance, within Freetown, as the case may be. I mean, the Local Government Act of 2004 actually made provision for city authority to actually be able to review those property tax. But had that been for over 10 years, that wasn't the kind of case. But having a mayor that had looked at it, that indeed there's a need for them to actually reduce some over-reliance on national government in terms of the basic set of budget provisions to be able to actually provide urban management and services for the people. She decided to actually engage in some, property tax reform, which was basically being supported by other international organizations and universities. So at least they're able to actually engage in some studies around. But at least within the course of that time, there are two major problems that actually came up. In terms of the property tax, that was more or less evaluation, the assessments, as well as collections. And these were being highly compounded by some of the key land titles at cadastral, which we are much more poorly developed. And this is only typical of Freetown, but even other, African countries as well had that kind of challenge. So in essence, for them to actually be able to ensure that they're able to raise a much needed set of resources, there was some bit of disagreement with the national government. Actually noting that indeed they are not actually being consulted during the course of actually doing the study itself. So that created a kind of bottleneck in terms of actually ensuring that indeed it is actually being implemented on the ground level. And the argument basically was that there was not much consultation and inclusiveness on the part of either the Ministry of Finance as well as the Ministry of Local Government that had a much more statutory, obligation to actually provide strategic directions and possibly be able to also set minimum standards for the operation of these local councils within the city. So at least there was some level of bottleneck, and at the end of the day, the government was not able to allow the mayor to actually proceed with the implementation of that property tax. But after some time, they had to come again and be able to actually hang heads together and discuss further. And after some few months, the government was actually able to lay down some of the key rules and procedures, which was much more in agreement with the civil society groups, the government, the municipal authority, and they are definitely being allowed to actually continue to implement the property tax. And through that process, they are able to actually raise much necessary resources for the municipal authority to engage with other provision of urban services within the city itself. So, I mean, that's the kind of challenge that often comes from. And of course, the government also wants to look themselves as somebody that is actually having much more passionate, for the people, and also be ready to actually provide those set of services. But that has been the kind of problematic situations, and of course, they're able to actually, deal with that situation, over time. And today, that implementation process is actually moving on.
Brahma, and just lastly, what advice would you give, whether it's any African city that's embarking on a process to engage with national or regional government in terms of taking on more powers? Should they go for everything and take on the operation of transport and housing functions, or should they go slowly and incrementally? I think we've lost Brahma. Brahma, can you hear me? I think we will wait a few more seconds to see if Brahma's with us, but if not, we'll move on to our next guest, Rudy Krill, who will give us...
Hello?
Hi, Brahma, are you still there?
Hello?
Rudy. Hi, Brahma. I was just asking you what advice... That's fine. What advice would you give to a city or a town that's looking to take on more powers or functions? Should they do it slowly? Should they take on transport, housing, or should they take small steps towards that?
Yeah, of course. Plenty devolution agenda will not only be an event, but has to actually definitely take some time. So definitely we require that continuous commitment for those actually in power and also support. Without necessarily, and those without. So you must be able to actually go a much more gradual process. More especially state that those that have the kind of legislative backing, must be kind of continuous process. And they should also be viewing themselves as not as a competitor, but also as a partner in terms of government, implementing government development programs and aspirations. At least you can be able to actually reduce that kind of tension among the different set of groups or parties.
Thank you so much, Brahma, and thank you for joining us, despite the line being a bit choppy from Cape Town to Freetown. Thank you for your insights, and for those that want to read more, we will be posting some of the links to the articles that speak to city level control, decentralization, and really giving more power. I see there's a quote about continuous commitment. So as much as cities want control, power, the ability to run city services, they also need to be committed to delivering those and to the quality of life of residents. And now for our next guest, Rudy Krill is a recent graduate, Master of Commerce student from Stellenbosch University, and I believe currently in Stellenbosch, in the field of transport economics. Rudy is passionate about public transport, electric mobility, and contributing towards the development of African countries and their transport networks. And he's currently working as a transport economist at Go Metro, working on introducing and implementing electric mobility to the South African minibus taxi industry. Thank you so much for joining us, Rudy.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I searched your entire thesis, which is entitled revitalizing rail, the case of public-private partnerships. And there was not a single use of the word devolution. There was no, so just maybe explain to us what your study of the Southern Rail Line in Cape Town was about, and how it relates to cities running transport, or to companies getting involved in the running of services.
Yeah, I'll try to limit myself because I can ramble on about this topic. So essentially my study was on seeing whether private sector participation or third party, whether it be a city or a private company, if they were to get involved in the running of passenger railway services in Cape Town, if that would be a viable method of reform. So we know that, and I think you're going to ask me a question about this later, but the president of South Africa mentioned that they wanted to reform the passenger railway service because, as we know, currently it's not really functioning at all. So we need to do something about this, and we know how important rail is in our integrated transport networks for cities, acting as a backbone in many of the cities. So we kind of are left with this gap, and this is leading to minibus taxi operations increasing, and all of the externalities we know are tied to road-based transport modes increasing. So my study was essentially investigating if private sector participation is a good way of reforming the industry of the network and getting it back to what it was post 2013, pre-2013, sorry.
And in terms of just to for those that are, I suppose, not that clued up on the transport sector, when we talk about private sector participation in rail, for example, would that be companies bringing in their own trains and running the service, or just managing stations, or bringing the train drivers, for lack of a better description? What does private sector participation mean?
So yeah, there's different types of private sector participation in rail. Specifically, you get what you call concessioning, which is essentially a joint ownership and venture between public sector and private sector. This is the most common one we find internationally because rail is such an expensive service to run. The capital cost of rail is very, very high and many times out of the scope of any private organization. And then on the other side, you get what Britain did, for example, which is privatization, which is the entire line, the maintenance thereof, the stations, the trains, and everything is bought over by a private company, and they run it independently with some policy intervention from the government. But in the case of South Africa, at the end of the study, we kind of concluded that concessioning is the way to go, just because there is so much maintenance that needs to be done on the railway line at the moment. We have speed restrictions everywhere on that line because it just wasn't properly maintained and invested into over its lifetime. The actual cars are all around 40 years old. So there's some significant investment required, and that's not something capable by a private firm at the moment.
And just, I do have a finance background, but it's a long time ago now. So, so correct me if I'm wrong. A conclusion of your investigation of the Southern Line is that if there is some form of private sector management involvement, it could improve the feasibility, but not necessarily make profits or become, I suppose, economically viable. Could you explain that a bit more in terms of what you meant by that?
Yeah, so any passenger transport service is very, very difficult to make profitable without government subsidies. The only railway line in the world, as far as I have it, is the Netherlands Spoor, which is the Dutch passenger railway service. They're the only one that can actually produce profit without government subsidies, and it's because their country is very well lined up for rail. It's densely populated, high density travel lines between cities. In South Africa, it's a different case because it's a big country, not very densely packed, and we don't have that utility that we see we need for rail. So in terms of private sector participation, I saw that financially it wouldn't be feasible just because of this. But this doesn't mean it's economically not feasible. It's still economically feasible because it will save passengers considerable amounts of time and money compared to other public transport modes. But financially, we see that a private firm that were to get involved, generally from international experience, we see that it improves the travel time, it improves the management of the system, it improves the comfort of the actual service. So Wi-Fi or seats would be improved, the security, and that would lead to more people using it. And even though it might lead to the ticket prices going up for that specific service, it could actually lead to more people using it because it's still much cheaper than using your own car, for example. If you look at the maintenance cost and the servicing and the operating cost of a private vehicle, it's still considerably less to use rail. So if we have a good alternative for using private transport, which there isn't currently, rail is really a viable mode of transport in that area.
Rudy, if we were to take, hypothetically, look at an example, let's say Cape Town. There's obviously hesitation around taking on a power or a function, which will require, as you mentioned, subsidies from somewhere, be it national or city or provincial. Would a city go about investigating every single line in terms of a similar study to what you've done, Northern Line, Central Line, or is it really looking around the whole system and then going to the private sector and saying, is this something you could operate over 30 years? I've seen in the past that when city governments have engaged with private sector, there's sort of a knowledge gap, very short-term leases in which it really makes no sense to get involved. So I suppose, could the research be replicated and could it provide better insights to city governments from that perspective?
Yeah, so one conclusion I actually made after doing my study was if you were to look at, for example, integrating private sector on the Central Line or the Belleville Line, you would need to do this entire study again. And that is just because the demographics on these lines are so different. And that means that the competitive nature in that sector is much different. And the travel behavior is different. Maybe it's shorter distances, which is better suited for taxi operations, for example. So yes, definitely, if I were to give my 5 cents to government and they were looking at and introducing this on different types of lines in Cape Town, they would definitely need to do some more investigating on the specific lines that we're interested in. The second point is getting private sector to participate on some of these lines is going to be a challenge. Because, for example, you can just imagine if you're a private company, you need to invest millions, not $1 billion rand into a line. You want your investment to be secure. And on many of these lines, this is not the case. We see a lot of risk and anger and vandalism in the railway industry, and that's something you need to consider. So they'll need to do more studies on specific lines, but they also need to take into consideration where private sector would get involved. And this is where the conversation changes when you say, well, City of Cape Town is interested in taking over these lines as well. And that changes things a little bit because, they're not a private company. They can take on more risk, essentially. And it just changes the equation a bit.
Rudy, to end on an optimistic note, are there any partnerships in your literature review or case studies where there's a working middle ground between public and private that perhaps the Global South or South Africa or Africa could learn from? I'm sure we can't replicate, but is there any optimistic note based on the research?
Yeah, we have seen, if you look at internationally, it's very mixed outcomes. There are countries that have changed to private sector participation and the rail services have increased in quality. More people are using it. Like in Britain, I know it's a bit controversial. Then there is a lot of downsides to it. People are complaining again that prices are going up, and there are downsides to it. But essentially, if you look at it now compared to before it was privatized, the services have improved considerably. And then again, you get I know you said I must be optimistic here, but then again, you get countries that privatized, realized it doesn't work, and then went back to public ownership. So a big waste of time and money. But I think if you plan it well enough, and you take into consideration the climate and the environment of your city, and don't just base it off what other countries did, there is definitely viability in a policy like this.
Rudy, a question from myself only. Light rail on the N1 and the N2, do cities have any powers to put their own trains on roads which they've built, or is that just completely politically unfeasible?
Well, I haven't even thought of that, but I'm sure it could be a possibility. I mean, there are so many. If you just look at the economics, and transport economics is really a problem, because government thinks that they need to react to increased road congestion by increasing road sizes. But you get what we call the rebound effect, which actually leads to more people using the roads, and the road just stays as congested as it was. So you're throwing that, money into water essentially. So I mean, I think looking at innovative ways and how we can save on congestion costs and other externalities is always a good idea.
Thank you so much, Rudy, and hopefully there'll be more of these studies to figure out what is possible. And I think it's a serious issue, the collapse of functioning passenger rail, intercity rail is a real issue. Rail still moves, for those who don't know, the most amount of people per hour, so significantly more than bus rapid transit, and significantly more than private cars, which I think you mentioned in this South African obsession with road widening and road building. Thank you so much. Our next guest is pleasure. Our next guest is Sindile Mavundla, who's the co-founder and director of Khadija Cycles, a one-stop bike shop aimed at creating and promoting the culture of cycling in townships, be that through learning to cycle, cycling to school, safer cycling. So a series of programs which come together to improve not just cycling, but people's views about cycling, making bicycles available, and so forth. Sindile, thank you so much for joining us. I believe you've just finished over 150 kilometers. We've done the maths. I think our maths is correct. 150 kilometers, 9 days around the Durban KZN area. I hope you were safe, by the way, with all the floods. Through the partnership with TUMI, the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, to see if cycling could connect better to this big, hard infrastructure called bus rapid transit or bus transit. Tell us a bit more about that experience, and I'm glad to see you alive and joining us in one piece.
No, thank you so much for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, it's been such an eye-opener for me, having actually, let me start by saying good afternoon to everyone. Thanks for having me. So yeah, I mean, we've been working as Culture Cycles with TUMI, trying to better understand how bicycles could be integrated into the greater transport system within Durban. But mostly what we looked at is that we wanted to look at what we have done in Cape Town, in Khadija pretty much. And that's pretty much, trying to create a cycling township. And that has not been easy because also you're introducing a mode of transport that has been used many, many years ago. And then the vehicle came about and then sort of that fizzled out, but now you're bringing that back into a space where the bicycle no longer really has a place, right? So there's no infrastructure at all in Khadija for a bicycle. Also, it's a mode where it's, people think it's a poor man's transport. And when we started this 5 years ago, that was the type of space we were in. And we started to see that change. And the change was brought about really by introducing learn to cycle classes, right? And we found that a lot of people have been wanting to learn how to ride a bicycle because this has been something that majority of them have been deprived of, because also to to have a bicycle is quite, it's quite a big thing. To afford one is even greater. So now you are enabling them to learn how to ride a bicycle, and immediately once they learn how to ride a bike, they ask you where to buy one. And you need to already have that type, to already have a point where they can buy a bicycle, an affordable bicycle, and find ways on financing that bicycle. But also a step further to that is, I have this bicycle now. I need you to show me how to commute using this bicycle. How do I go from my house to the mall? And it starts with these small distances, from my house to going to the shopping center, from cycling with other people, creating this community. And that's what people actually want, is a community of cyclists. And we started this shop out of that need. And from 5 years ago until today, we have seen such an amazing change in Khayelitsha, not just only change from more people coming to taking up cycling, but change from motorists in Khayelitsha. We used to have quite a lot of safety issues, people getting hit by cars, and that has decreased dramatically. And we are starting to see even the usual suspects, the taxis, taxi drivers, minibus taxis. And we had to form a really good relationship with them, in the sense that they are able to, they notice the bicycle now. They respect the bicycle. Obviously, you still have one or two bad apples into that. But when we went to Durban, for me personally, I went to Durban with an open mind of really going to learn. And to me, we made this decision that we want to go and see what is currently happening on the ground. We have 3 areas in Durban that we were really focusing on. We were focusing in Mlazi, we were focusing in KwaMashu, and then we were focusing in Mhlanga. And the reason why we identified these areas, they're some of the biggest areas in Durban, and particularly the 2 townships, which is Mlazi and KwaMashu. And it was extreme sports, honestly, to cycle from the CBD of Durban into either Mlazi and Mhlanga, because there's no infrastructure at all. You have big intersections that you have to cross. We used different apps, for example, Commute, Strava, to find where people are actually, what routes are they using to cycle into the city and out of the city. And each and every ride you take, you have to either get into a huge highway with like 4 lanes, and you are literally, riding on top of a yellow line, and you are just a sitting duck, and anything can happen to you. But also you get into, the smaller sections, the avenues, and it's quite, there's a lot of traffic. And we then found that cycling to Mhlanga, which is more of an affluent area, it's more of a suburb area, there's a lot of infrastructure there, but it's underutilized. So it's utilized mostly on the weekends. That's when people actually cycle for more of like, obviously commuting to the promenade, but not particularly commuting to work. And we saw another part was another street that we explored was Florida Road, which some might know as, this vibey, trendy area. And it was fantastic because I was literally staying there, and it was fantastic to see how people in that street are starting to warm up to bicycles. And there's a group there that is called, it's actually a group that comes from Cape Town. It's called Roop Durban. So they run bicycle cycles throughout, I think it's actually happening on Thursdays, twice a month. And they start riding, it's a social ride. People start riding at 6 o'clock. And it brings people together into Florida Road, but it takes them into the heart of the city, Durban Central, which is bubbling with so many activities. And they get to experience, some of them, even they've been in Durban for a very long time, they've never taken a bicycle or even been in the CBD. So it gives them that opportunity to explore their own town using a bicycle and get to engage with different people around that. So we explored also part of that. Maybe before, I know I also can ramble a lot, but I'll just minimize myself. Part of the biggest issue that we got from the questions or the conversations that we were having with a lot of people has been around safety. Durban being a big city dominated by the minibus industry, it's very challenging to see how people are terrified of taxis and also taxi buses, but also the safety for them. I think that's the biggest thing. A lot of Durban people want to cycle. They would love to ride their bikes to work around their streets, but the biggest challenge that they have is navigating the city together on live traffic with taxi drives. And I mean, even for me, I had quite a lot of close passes. But I mean, those are some of the things that we've come out with, and we feel that with the BRT currently, that is not yet operational, and hopefully it will get operational, is that even with that, some of the stations are quite far from where people actually stay. So it's quite, I mean, that last mile or that first mile to the train station or to the bus station is quite of a challenge. But now, could a bicycle solve that problem by cycling to the bus station, locking your bike in there, getting into the bus to the CBD, and be able to get another bicycle from the CBD and commuting to your office or to wherever you work. So those are some of the things that we've managed to research together with some of the rental bicycle companies that are around in Durban in some of the areas there. So yeah.
In terms of the cycling and walking infrastructure in South Africa and the promotion of cycling, I suppose two questions. The first is, what are all the quick wins that we're missing? I think all of us want to get lots of people onto lots of bicycles on big roads going large distances. But I suppose first is, I know I go to Durban quite a lot. The promenade is incredible, Fada Road is incredible, the CBD is vibrant, and of course there are other areas you went to, Mhlanga, KwaMashu, etc. But what are the quick wins that we're just not seeing? And then secondly, how is the promotion of cycling changing? Because when you look at Cape Town, one could say that between your shop and your initiative, Langa Bicycle Hub, Upcycles, that it's through citizen-led businesses and initiatives that have almost done a bit more than entire city governments to promote cycling per se. So two questions: what are the quick wins? And is the model of improving mobility changing towards being more grassroots?
Yeah, so I mean, key quick win for me is replicating the bike bus model, right? The bike bus model. I mean, we built on it here in Cape Town. I mean, it was done by other initiatives. Open Streets was one of the organizations that was building on what was already happening. And they will do these bike buses. And the bike bus, maybe just for benefit of others, is a group of people that actually, cycle together. They meet at a certain time. There's a specified route, and then it's like a group ride, and then they will ride together. And we can take it even further, where it becomes a little bit more technical, where we have a bike bus leader, which is the person that leads the whole group. We have marshals. These are people that actually, ensure or look after the riders or the bike bus passengers within this single file ride, of people. And they just also within that, you have people who specialize in mechanics that can do if ever you have a breakdown. So this is the same thing that you can replicate even with school kids, right? It's a bike bus. Kids normally in some areas, they walk together to school. And if ever there is proper infrastructure, for example, here in Rondebosch, you find a lot of kids cycling together to school. And I think these are some of the quick wins that we can have. For example, in Durban, which is something that we're already working on now, is a bike bus that is coming from Umhlanga into the CBD. Another bike bus that's actually coming from Mlazi into town, but we are trying to still figure out the route around there. But even smaller is bike buses going to different events around the community, bike buses going to a coffee shop in the morning for people to meet and conversate and have these type of discussions that we're having right now. And Quick Wins, part of that is just opening up these learn to cycle clinics, for people to start learning how to ride a bicycle, how to do basic maintenance of their own bikes, setting up, very basic workshops to sustain the bicycles that are in that area. Those are some of the stuff that we would, I would say, are quick wins in terms of encouraging, cycling and the work that has been done by, Upcycle, by Longer Bicycle Hub, for example. It's been quite frustrating for us as Culture Cycles quite a lot, because we've been having these conversations, with the city, for example, the city of Cape Town, in terms of, setting up an initiative here in Kalicha as a pilot, for example. And then we find ourselves having to do these things on our own to show them that this model works. And we came to a point where we just told ourselves that we'll continue doing the heavy lifting, and if ever the city decides to join in, they will. But we'll just continue to do what we do. And I think one of the conversations we were having, funny enough, leading into World Bicycle Day, is we need to start creating these critical mass rides that can really create a sense of urgency for the city to start taking this, to start integrating cycling and taking it very seriously as a mode that can be preferred by people. And I think it really starts with the city in terms of supporting openly these type of initiatives and putting investments into them. So yeah, I think, I won't dwell into the frustration, but I think, there's a lot of movement in the ground in Cape Town, and in terms of advancing what has been done in terms of commuter cycling. I think sports cycling is doing very, very well, but now it's just how do we translate that into commuting? You have over, I think, 30,000 people that do the cycle tour, if not more. But now, how do we translate that into commuter cycling on a daily? It's a lot of people have bicycles, right? It's not that, of course, some still can't afford bicycles, but to have 30,000 people in a sporting event, which is the cycle tour, where are we missing, that unlock where people can, after the cycle tour, can still continue to ride their bicycles to their workplaces? Obviously, the corporates needs to come on board on that in terms of how do we make cycling, how do we encourage cycling within our own spaces as corporates? How do we make showers available? How do we make these essential basic needs that people need, cyclists need? How do we even incentivize, employees to take up cycling, and finding incentives that are very beneficial to them, not just, stuff that they cannot use. Yeah.
I think it's interesting you mentioned, just that you'll wait until the support is ready from the various authorities, and I assume you're talking about the city and provincial transport departments, which have annual budgets of multiple billions of rands, but are unable to support a series of community-led and operated initiatives to promote mobility. I start to think that the world is moving in one way, but the transport planners, unfortunately, and those that control budgets are perhaps still stuck in 10 or 15 years ago. And we saw that once again with the public engagement process to so-called ban cycling on the promenade. And you really wonder in which alternative universe some of these city officials live in, when cycling is not just about the promotion of bikes and cycling, but it's a social justice issue. It's an issue of carbon emissions. It's an issue of our climate transitioning, on our energy usage transitioning, not just about the needs of cyclists. And it's really just from what we've seen, a philosophy that cars are always first in every situation, every intersection, and everything else needs to fit around that. And I think that's going to take a while to change. But what we've seen with our various crises in energy and rail that often things need to get really bad before they get better. But I hope for your sake that if not the city of Cape Town or the authorities in the Western Cape, then the eThekwini municipality and the KwaZulu-Natal province starts to make some small changes to improve not just cycling but mobility and walking, pedestrian crossing times at major interchanges. I'd like to bring all of our panelists back, and also our co-moderator Livingston Mukasa, who you would have heard from during yesterday's keynote lectures and yesterday evening's debrief. But just as an introduction, Livingston Mukasa has a career in architectural practice, urban design, master planning, real estate development, and sustainable development consulting. And we were very fortunate to come across Livingston's more recent work, The Architectural Guide of Sub-Saharan Africa, which was launched, I believe, in 2021. 7 volumes documenting architecture of all the 49 countries that are south of the Sahara. And as Livingston mentioned yesterday, in most cases, undocumented buildings and architecture. So Livingston will be joining us as we take some of your questions and engage with some of our panelists. I'd like to start, Livingston, with Marina's comments. City planners are definitely sometimes living in an alternate reality. Since we're on the note of possible futures, I think we'll see if there are firstly any questions that we could get to. I think there's a question here. Aside from traffic, did you encounter any crime? And is that impacting the culture of cycling, or is it too difficult to tell from your 9 days since?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a bit difficult to say, but I mean, there was never any, being it my first time ever in Devon, and cycling with the people that, usual commuters that use the routes. And it was amazing to connect with these people, ever meeting them for the first time as well. But I've never, even in their own experiences, they've never, experienced any muggings, any of them, their bikes getting stolen. But I mean, it does happen, I'm not saying it wouldn't happen. It can happen anywhere. I think for me, I felt very safe as well, commuting from these 3 areas. And I think I felt more safe commuting through from the CBD to Umhlanga, but mainly because of the infrastructure. That part for me, it felt like I was riding at home, which is, here in Cape Town for some weird reason. But I mean, it can happen to anyone anyway.
Thank you, Sindile, for that, and thank you to all the panelists. This has been very engaging and very insightful. We all know the phrase, "It takes a village to raise a child," but along those same lines, it takes a diverse community to make a city thrive. And this was a very interesting disciplinary discussion on different initiatives that make our cities better for everybody. I have some questions for all of you, and I'd like to start with Doreen. Doreen, are you here?
Oh, yes, I'm here.
Excellent. Thank you so much for some of the thoughts you shared. And full disclosure, I happen to know Doreen quite well, but that doesn't mean I'll take it easy on you. So, Doreen, wetlands are often seen as wastelands. They're a nuisance. They're just there to be filled and built upon. And I think what excited me about your work is how unique it is. Unique in that, architecture is about the built environment, making things, making buildings. And few architects actively advocate for the natural environment, which is often seen as the work of, environmentalists, ecologists, or landscape architects. So seeing you, an architect, actively engaged in mitigating the effects of a problem that members of your own profession are actively working towards accelerating is wonderful. But it also pits you against the work of many of your own professional colleagues. So I was wondering if you could speak to some of those challenges.
Thanks, that's a good question. So this concept of the wetlands as a wasteland was actually coined by the colonial government at the time. They're the ones that said there's a wastelands and started to, in their planning of the city, had already put that aside for further development for other things, and the things seen as wastelands. But in the Buganda tradition, the wetlands were a spiritual space for renewal, is the way that it was seen. And so here we are today, where we have the city growing very fast, and then these wetlands are there, and then there's this almost like a clash of the two. And I initially became interested in the wetlands because I just saw what happens over time. There's a lot of flooding. You know, that water was supposed to be absorbed and eventually get to Lake Victoria. But because there's so much being built on top of spaces that would absorb the water, there was more flooding, and we can't avoid this flooding that is happening. It's actually coming to a point, even the lake itself is, the levels are going up. So what you're saying is right. Like, have I put myself in this position where I'm against, let's say, another type of architect who's actively building in this space? I don't actively think about it, but what I would say is that we can't avoid the fact that this flooding is happening, and we shouldn't wait until it's too late, you know? I kind of think like Rudy, when Rudy was giving basically worst case scenarios. It's the same case with this, in the case that let's not forget about the wetlands, because we're going to get to a point of the flooding that's going to happen. There might be some level, we shouldn't get to a point where there's a big distraction that makes us then say, oh, let's go back to, let's not wait to get to that point, I guess is what I'd like to say. And so I kind of just see myself as what I call an advocate for architecture. I normally just put it that way, where my goal is just to bring awareness. Not necessarily saying you should do this or do that, but be aware, basically as we work within this building environment that we're in. And as you know, Uganda and Kampala, it's very difficult to, there are many, how can I put it? It's very hard to, I'm trying to think of the best way. They're very, for example, the city is very organized, like the Kampala City Council. They have a good master plan. In the master plan, they actually have those wetlands as places that are going to be, that should be protected. So what you see in their master plan is a good master plan, but what you see on the ground is now a whole other thing.
Entirely different.
Yes, yeah. So so that's basically, that's the challenge. That's what's on paper and then what's on the ground.
And it was very interesting for you to mention the role of indigenous knowledge systems too in managing these natural resources, which makes us remember, because we all too often forget, that the African urban environments did not begin with colonialism. Africa had a lot of pre-colonial urban settlements, and they were managed quite successfully. So looking back at our past, sometimes we can find solutions for our future. So thank you. I appreciated that comment very much. also wanted to ask you about some of the potential recreational uses or benefits of wetlands, and how the city of Kampala can accommodate these, because African cities generally fall short in their access to nature and green spaces in comparison to cities in the Northern Hemisphere. And this adds to the many expressions of socioeconomic inequalities. So is there potential for looking at wetlands not only for their natural benefits, but also for recreational uses of that the general public can enjoy, and also market them for tourism purposes? Is there growth in that area? And if so, how can Kampala take advantage?
That's a good question. The case study that I would give is Bogota. Is that, what country is that? Colombia?
Colombia, yes.
Yeah, Colombia, Bogota. So their city really took on this wetlands. They have the same wetlands challenge in Bogota, and then actually actively worked towards having exactly what you've described, like recreative services, a way for the wetlands to continue to be there, but also have these different activities. And so what I would suggest that everyone just looks at that as an example. It's a very good case study. And that's what I would hope for Uganda, that we get to a point where we have the wetlands and also have these recreative activities, even just like nature, and all these other ways of having the wetlands remain, at the same time other activities that are equally beneficial.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much once again, Doreen. Brima, you raised a very important issue, devolution. It's one that we're hearing more and more about across the continent. And in yesterday's conversation, we spoke a little bit about it, particularly regarding the role of democratization of public services. All too often, we see a lot of top-down approaches that don't really focus on the recipients of these services. And this raises public apathy towards government services. People are not excited by them. People generally don't expect much from their governments. And that's because in many cases, the average citizen, and average meaning, the everyday person who earns under $1 a day, is their own service provider. They provide their own energy, they dispose of their own waste, they're responsible for their own security. So to them, the role of government generally plays a very minimal role in their day-to-day lives. I was wondering if you could talk about briefly about how devolution can contribute towards improving service delivery in African cities, and what specific cases can you think of, or have you seen in your research where this has been achieved, whether in Freetown or elsewhere in Africa?
Yeah, of course, if I actually want to be much more successful with devolution issues within Africa, then of course, it has to be based on what we call a kind of shared vision or shared objective. And this is also not only being supported by the relevant set of stakeholders, but also the general citizens have to have a kind of role to play into that particular process. And the starting point for actually be able to actually ensure that is that there should be in place what we call a kind of participatory, inclusive, and a kind of consensus-driven process to actually be able to drive development aspiration of a much more shared vision. And that will enable us to actually be able to shape the relevant set of reforms, policies that are more or less acting as an inhibition in terms of the social challenge affecting the evolution process, in Africa and also elsewhere as well. So, and of course, there must be kind of adequate financial and administrative support to actually ensure that at least some of these pieces are actually being done. And of course, we have seen other countries, like, of course, that's already been noted within, for instance, the Kenya, the South Africa situations, and some few other successful stories. I mean, it's about how well can you actually be able to ensure that these other actors are much more aware about what is actually being, moving on, and how systems are definitely working, and how some of these long-term development programs are not being subjected to kind of resistance. And this often is based on some of it, how best you're able to actually involve them within the evolving kind of the process itself, in terms of either even policy or strategy or action-oriented development programs within the city itself. And that can definitely be able to ensure that these citizens actually remain much more committed, and they're able to actually see the kind of development activities actually moving on in there. But they might want to only drop pay taxes and some of these things without then actually seeing physical reform process or development activities or services that they are actually able to have access to and be able to actually use. So that needs to actually be done. And these are also, happening in few other cities, across Africa and beyond as well.
And can you, are there any specific cases where we have seen an improvement in the delivery of these services because of devolution in some way?
It's really much more, but at least in countries like Kenya, for instance, devolution actually worked, because it's actually moving down up to even the country level, and these are able to actually ensure that they're able to actually provide the much needed services. Of course, even though they had, quite a good number of other challenges that are definitely emerged, within that kind of setting. And even South Africa as well had a very good process as well.
Now, in terms of specific services like, say, waste disposal, obviously competition is a good thing, because the more players you have in this space, the more improved services one can attain. So in your experience and in the work that you've done, have you seen cases where a particular service delivery, whether it's waste disposal or energy management, or even drainage, has been improved by these by the democratization of these policies, by devolution? Is there any case study that you can mention regarding a specific service delivery that has actually improved the lives of citizens, of urban citizens?
Well, that one is highly been contested as well. In terms of how services are actually being delivered, because it also differ from cities to city or from region to region where the devolution process really are moving. And this is often being based on the commitment of the national government or central government to actually ensure that those structures actually had autonomy, in terms of some of the key service delivery, at this particular end. But it has been much more challenging in most cities in terms of how best they will actually be able to deal with waste minimization or waste related process, because you have quite a good number of what applies, only about the municipal councils. Of course, we have also the private sector and even donor agencies as well, are able to actually come in and be able to actually address some of these different, critical, challenges within the city itself. So, like for instance, in our city, for instance, we have had a number of other donor agencies that are able to actually bring in much more resources, and also NGOs are also working within the urban space, are also be able to bring out their own resources based on the common document that they are able to actually develop. But this is often being undermined in terms of working actually on the ground by the national government, specifically, actually giving that free hand for them to actually be able to deliver some of these different services. And more specifically, the only one is around sanitation. Sanitation have been, but that one also is a big challenge actually within most cities in Africa, not only within Sierra Leone, but every other area.
Correct.
Really
Correct. Thank you for your insight. Rudy, you shed a lot of light on rail, and that was awesome, because rail is essential, but rail is also expensive. It's expensive to finance. It's expensive to procure, expensive to operate, expensive to maintain. And then there are also other challenges too, like government not wanting to relinquish control over public safety and security, which are essential towards effective rail services. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the kinds of impediments that public-private partnerships face in making rail more attainable, particularly in resource-scarce environments that we find plenty of on the African continent. So where do these two interests, the interests of the private sector and the interests of the public sector, where do the interests of these two sides butt heads? And along the same lines, could you also talk about the pros and cons of foreign investment in rail in Africa, given the expense? We've seen some debt traps, for example, in Kenya with their single gauge railway. So any thoughts on that would be helpful as well.
Great, thank you for the question. And excuse if the sound is a bit worse now. So that's a big question, is where is the interest from private sector, and how does that fall in line with the policy that government has for rail and for public transport? The reason why I said and the reason why passenger transport is usually not profitable is because government wants it to be as accessible as possible, and as affordable as possible, so that people don't have to use road-based transport modes. And of course, a lot of people in South Africa don't have the capacity or the financing to use private vehicles. So we want it to be as cost-effective and efficient as possible. But then if you integrate private sector participation in this entire thing, which is predominantly profit-driven, you have to ask yourself the question: to what extent is government willing to pay subsidies to a private organization, and know that some of that money is going in as profit, as a margin on that investment? And that is it's really a question that I can't fully answer, because I mean the thing is also, it's difficult for a private organization to answer that question, because they need to provide in a proposal the extent to which they can be profitable, but that's all dependent on the amount of ridership on that certain line, and they can't ensure that ridership would be a fixed deliverable. So many models internationally, as we see that the subsidy that's paid to the private sector is tied to the amount of ridership that the actual service gets, and I think that's a viable way of doing it. And then getting to your second point on foreign investment, I've gone through a lot of case studies, and I've also become aware that many countries' passenger railway services are now owned by other countries. And that even puts the policy or the integrated transport plan more in jeopardy of a country, because now you have these foreign, players in your country, and maybe you have a railway network that is better operated and functional, but the key strategy decisions you have to make now is much more complicated to implement.
So, and there are also questions of in whose interests is it being operated?
Exactly. Oh yeah, and then the point of rail being very expensive, you are absolutely correct. I mean, I only started working with rail in the 2 years of my master's, and in that time, when I looked at the budgeting of PRASA on that line, it is absolutely mind-blowing to see how much is budgeted. Not, I won't say actually spend it, because that's another point of controversy if actual money is being spent on maintenance. But it's really massive budgets. And then you can also argue that, you know, the same subsidy that's currently going into the publicly operated line can be used for a private service, and it might be that that subsidy level is actually quite equal. But on the side of the private sector participation, you now have a railway line that it has much more opportunity to be functional than being in public hands. So I think it's a question of the same amount of money could get you a better running service.
And with the South African example, where is government getting it wrong?
I think there are so many levels, and it's not like short-term decisions. I think from the financial side, what I've seen, the main thing that South Africa did wrong was that we didn't properly maintain our infrastructure. We didn't properly maintain our rolling stock and the overhead traction equipment. And those are the things, the assets and the equipment is the main driving the cost force behind rail. So now we had a railway line that functioned well, but it's like your car, you don't maintain, suddenly it breaks, and it's not one thing breaking, it's 50 things breaking. And you have this cart sitting there and they're refurbishing it and they're fixing a thing when it breaks, but it keeps on breaking. So, and then that leads to a lot of delays, and it leads to, 75% of people using passenger railway service in South Africa say that, delays and unreliability is the first thing that they're worried about every day. And that puts people's jobs in jeopardy and restricts them from actually using the service.
Thank you very much. Sindile, I think it was the mayor of Curitiba in Brazil who once so eloquently said, and I can't quote directly, unfortunately, but it was something along the lines of a developed country isn't where poor people have access to cars, but where the rich people use public transportation. So I really appreciated the way you focus on cycling and trying to make biking become part of the public transportation infrastructure. I was wondering if you could talk about your experience in Khayelitsha, having not traditionally boasted a vibrant cycling culture. How were you able to build this culture? How were you able to make cycling more sexy across all age groups? And what are some of the examples of the pushbacks you've received or seen from the public? And also, what assistance would you need from municipal authorities that would make this culture grow? For example, Kigali in Rwanda has 2 days a month where the streets are car free. Is this something that local governments can do in South Africa to help build this culture?
Yeah, so I'll try and be very, very quick on that one. The culture for us, obviously, how we created it is, and I love your word of how did we make it sexy, and I think that has been, the key thing. How do you make it accessible? And I think also the key word here is access. We had to ensure that not only we just actually, providing learn to cycle classes, which are free learn to cycle classes, that's how we started, is that we're able to get people to as well. And I think that went down to sort of the economics of buying a bicycle, unlocking the cash flow, because majority of the people, when we started, big pushback that we got was from the bicycle distribution companies. How are people in townships are going to afford these bicycles, which was one of that issue, is that they are often looked down to, whereas people in the township have money. It's just the cash flow issue that they have, right? So if you bring an affordable bicycle or an affordable service, they will be able to buy it. And that's what we have been unable, where we've been able to unlock that, but also people want to be part of something. And that's where the community comes in. You know, not only do they just come and join bicycle rides, you can call your friends and go for a ride. But, you know, if ever there's something more meaningful in that community that people want to be part of. I mean, we have, you know, middle-class people that come from, you know, different other parts of Cape Town that come to only ride in Khayelitsha. And I think there's a key thing that, or a drawing card that they actually, you know, are attracted to in there. But I think the biggest part for us in terms of, you know, our focus now, maybe, let me say, is expanding. How do we expand this into other townships? Looking into Guguletu, looking into Hart Bay, looking into Masiphumelele. I think these are Strand, for example, is such a very key example for us where we want to expand, replicate this, and hopefully into, you know, city of eThekwini in Durban, which I think has, you know, incredible, you know, potential.
Thank you. We're running close to the end of this session, I just have one really, really quick question I'd like everybody to chime in on. What specific and attainable intervention in your respective cities, if everything was under your control, say today's your lucky day and you were given full agency to implement whatever you want in imagining the possibilities of Africa's urban future, what one specific intervention would you implement in your various disciplines and in your respective cities? We'll start with Doreen.
I was just thinking, well, I'll talk about the wetlands since that's what, you know, we've discussed in detail. So I think what I would like for Kampala is for the government and also the city council to look more closely into the wetlands and start having policies and actively protect the wetlands. Yeah, moving forward, that would be my dream.
Thank you so much, Doreen. Brima?
Yeah, my dream really is that for the revolution to actually take effect, we must be ready to strengthen the legal and institutional frameworks so that at least the revolution can have a kind of maximal impact in serving the interests of the citizens as a whole.
Thank you so much.
That should be my
Thank you very much. Rudy?
I'm really passionate about public transport, and I think my dream is to be able to live in Cape Town without having to own my own car or private transport. That would be my dream. To have, you know, a real transport network, a public transport network that works and it's integrated and well functioning. Yeah.
That's a dream for many of us as well. Sindile, final words.
Yeah, I think I share the same with Rudy, definitely. And I think for me personally, it will be also to finally get that political will to make really key decisions around integrated transport. Yeah.
And I hope on that note, governments and other authorities were listening to you all. This has been very insightful. Thank you very much. Over to you, Rashiq.
Thank you so much, Livingston, and thank you to our panelists and everyone who attended. The theme of today was agency, and I just had a thought that, you know, whether it's the protection of our wetlands, the development of our rail sector, there's possibly a need for new forms of agencies or institutions. And our questions about cycling and movement are not necessarily about transport, but about giving people in cities agency, freedom to move freely, to walk safely, to connect easily, to combine the best of, you know, the mobile phone potential with their daily lives. And it's really that. It's not about one particular mode being better, one particular direction being better, but about really expanding agency to the fullest extent and giving everyone that chance to access economic opportunities, educational opportunities in the fullest sense. So thank you to everyone really, from Kampala, Freetown, Stellenbosch, Cape Town, Livingston. I think we somehow found a common thread despite very different views, economics, design, advocacy, and governance. Really, there really was a common thread that ultimately agency of people is what we're all working towards. Thank you, everyone. Please join us at 6 p.m. We will have a debrief session, an evening conversation with the keynote lecturers from today's 12 p.m. keynote lectures. Please join us then, and you'll get a chance to engage more freely. Bring your dinner, bring your drinks. Tomorrow, our Future Cities hosts another session. The program starts at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, but at 3 p.m. our session is called Africa Now, the urgent need and case for investment in sustainable urban development, in particular, looking at the need to drive affordable housing quicker through finance. Thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.